Mic test. Okay. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard.
He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent.
And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside.
Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, walked backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness.
When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him,
He said, Cursed be Canaan, servant of servant, shall he be to his brothers.
he also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be a servant.
God enlarged Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant.
After the flood, Noah lived 350 years together. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Amen. You may be seated. Okay, so we've been digging into as much detail as possible, looking at Noah's work, Noah's comparison to Adam, Noah's comparison to Cain, his identity as the priest of God, his identity as the covenant head, and much, much more. We need to look carefully at these backgrounds because without these details, you can't really make sense of what's going on with Noah's sin. So here's what I mean. You may have heard of Noah as a story, or maybe you watched a movie about it, or a TV show about it, or cartoons about it, or even the Sights and Sound theater. And what you'll see is they don't exactly explain what Noah's sin exactly is, or what was Ham's sin, that Noah would curse Canaan. So only one of Ham's children, instead of all of them, is cursed. So this is something we got to think about. Ham has many children, so why does Noah only curse one? The cartoons we watch, the movies we watch, the theaters we watch, it doesn't really go into details about these things. Oh so for those of you who didn't know, Noah did not curse Ham. Noah cursed Ham's son. So that's even odd in and of itself. Because you would figure if Ham's the one that offended Noah, why does Noah curse Ham's sons instead? So first of all, we need to discuss some views out in the wild within Christian literature so that we can see they are not proper in the light of the context we've been detailing about Noah. So there's several views outside, several mainstream views about what's going on in Noah, but in the Reformed view, it's not proper because it doesn't consider all the details. So let's look at Genesis 9, chapter 22. Genesis 9:22. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. All right. In other parts of the Bible, seeing someone's nakedness has sexual overtones. So if you read through passages like Leviticus 18, God uses this particular phrase, the nakedness of X, Y, and Z, nakedness of this person or that person, means to have sex with. So here's a few examples. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 3 through 7. You shall not do as they do. This is talking about the Canaanites. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you live, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes, so their ways. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. So God is setting up a stage here. He's setting up a context. He's saying, don't follow their ways. Follow my ways. And he keeps repeating this to emphasize that it's his ways that we need to follow. Verse 6. None of you shall approach any one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother, and you shall not uncover her nakedness. So there's like sexual overtones here. It's not like, oh, I saw somebody, naked. That's not what God's talking about. It's talking about beyond that. So there's the literal sense, but it's pushing towards like the, beyond literal sense here. So then some of the commentators within Christian leaders go, oh, don't do the things after Egypt nor Canaan, which I'm bringing you. They make note of that and go, oh, so Ham, since Leviticus 18 has sexual overtones, Genesis 9 must have sexual overtones. So the commentators go, oh, Ham must have had sodomite sex with Noah. So Noah is cursing Ham. Noah's cursing Ham's son Canaan because the Canaanites were known to do the same thing. And as we know from Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, and God's brimstone and fire from heaven and destroyed those cities and all those people for their homosexual acts. That must be the reason why Noah's cursing Ham. That must be what it's about. So that's one mainstream view within Christian literature. And here we want to comment. While Canaanites did practice every aberrant sexual sin, and while the homosexual identity is condemned as a sin in the Bible, these sins actually fall under the marriage covenant topic of sin and does not reflect Ham's sin if we look at the details of what happened with Noah and Ham. So that's one of the mainstream views. So there's a different mainstream view. Some Christians have the view that Ham's curse was to be black and therefore a slave to other races. And if you take a look at this in the historic sense, this view came about in the Jewish rabbinic literature first and then showed up in the American literature later. But it is not a historic nor traditional Christian view. So if you look at the Christian literature all the way back to like Chrysostom, right? There's none of this blacks were slaves theology that came out of the rabbinic literature. And then from the rabbinic literature, it was passed on to the American literature, American Christian literature. And we're going to talk more about this topic later when we get to the Tower of Babel, because this becomes sort of like an important topic. Like, how did the races form? How did the ethnicities form? But here we want to make a point. We want to make a note about this. The idea of race, quote unquote, race in the Bible. So this is a biblical view now. There's only two races in the Bible, one from Adam and one from Jesus Christ. There's no other race. You're either in Adam or you're in Christ. These are the only two races of men in the Bible. The closest word to our modern notion of race is ethnicity. And this is actually determined by language and the culture that developed, the local culture that developed as the result of the language and the local community that spoke that language. And this is why this has to be talked about in Babel and not here. Because it's language that affects ethnicity, and the ethnicity is the closest notion that we have to our modern notion of race. Because the biblical notion of race, where one can't intermingle or one can't mix, is Adam and Jesus Christ's race. There's no other race because there's no other covenant head. So more on this topic later. Oh, and we want to make a note here. If you hold to the idea is race defined by physical appearance or DNA, you have drank the Jewish rabbinic Kool-Aid because it's in their literature first. And your anthropology, which is to say your view of man, does not reflect God's notion of race and ethnicity, but rather the Jewish literature's view of ethnicity and race. So then what's going on with Noah and his children here in relation to God? So if those two mainstream views are not the case, then what's going on here? Well, as mentioned before, Noah became a tiller of the ground, a farmer, a husbandman, and not a keeper of the animals as well, as he should have been. So Noah is supposed to be both a keeper of the land and a keeper of the animals. He's supposed to combine the works of both Abel and Cain. But he didn't do that. So whatever Noah was before, so we can assume maybe he was a carpenter or an architect or an engineer because he was able to build the ark that God commanded him to build. Does that make sense? We can assume he might have been a carpenter, architect, or somebody that builds large-scale things, like an engineer. But the point is, Noah knew, so even as he was an engineer or carpenter, whatever it was, even though that was what he was doing before, he also knew how to produce wine. That's the point. So what are we talking about here? Well, let's get Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. So Noah, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous or a just man, blameless or perfect in his generation. Noah walked with God. Noah was a righteous man. He was a perfect man in his generation. He was blameless in God's sight. So that means Noah is going contrary to like the rest of the world. Does that make sense? There's something going on in the rest of the world, and Noah is contrary to it. And that contrariness from faith is what God sees as just. He says, your faith, something's different about Noah, different than the rest of the world. And it's based on his faith. So since Noah was able to make wine immediately after the flood, we can assume he knew the order of the fermentation process. Because if you ever try to make wine, you know that if you let juices or things stay out, they rot. You need to have a special process to make it ferment. Does that make sense? That means Noah already knew how to make wine before the flood because he was able to make it immediately. So based on this verse 6-9 here, because Noah was perfect in his generation, Noah would not have drank wine, because Noah understood as a just man of God, all things that God has given us, we're supposed to use to maintain a sound mind. Noah would have understood that. All the things that God gave us, we're supposed to use to maintain a sound mind. So that's why medicine becomes then important, because medicine helps us to stay healthy in order for us to have a sound mind. Why? Because we need a sound mind, we need a healthy mind in order to know the difference between holy and unholy, clean and unclean, right and wrong, good and evil, integrity and corruption, virtue and vice. You need a healthy mindset to distinguish between these two things. And the example that I gave last week was, if you're healthy, try to live a holy life. And then when you're only getting like 3 or 4 hours of sleep every day for like a year, try to live a holy life. And now you'll notice, if your brain or if your mind is very sleepy all the time and tired all the time, it's not easy. It's more difficult to live a holy life. That's the point, because your mind is not as sound as it used to be. So all things that God has given us, we're supposed to be using always for the sake of having a sound mind in order to know the difference between holy and unholy. Because that's what priests, that's our premium capital, a sound mind, a sound judgment. So Noah knew wine affected his judgment negatively. This is something he already knew. It was a corrupter of a sound mind. So then why was Noah a just man in his generation? Because he recognized the difference between holy and unholy. So now we're getting to this point here where Noah's faith, his faith that God is going to send the Messiah, that faith in that Messiah of God, that second firstborn of God, caused him to go, and I need to prepare for that day when that man of God arrives. So he's preparing for that day, and he doesn't want to have a clouded judgment or a clouded mind when that guy appears. So it's this faith that God sees as righteous. Well, Pastor Tom, how can you say that? How can you know what Noah's time period was like? Well, because the Bible says so. Luke chapter 17. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. So there's a difference between day and days here. Days is talking about the last days, which is a culminating point to the last day, which is Judgment Day, which is the day that Jesus Christ comes back. So days is talking about a lengthy period of time. Just as in the days of Noah, it will be in the days of the Son of Man, okay? So Jesus Christ is describing what Noah's days were like. They, Noah's generation, were eating and drinking and marrying and being given into marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. So if you remember, they saw Noah build the ark for almost 100 years because it took a roughly 70 to 100 years. It roughly took that amount of time to finish building the ark. So there's a sign, a token of God's judgment. That's like, basically Noah's like, well, let me put it to you this way. Noah's ark was big news in Noah's time because Noah was the conspiracy theorist who was saying that water was going to fall from the sky and drown all things. During a time when everybody knew water came out of the ground in the form of a mist. Right? So everybody knew water came out of the ground as a form of a mist. And there's a guy, his name is Noah, and he's saying, no, water's going to come from the sky, and it's going to drown everything. He's a conspiracy theorist. So as you read this verse, you might be like, Pastor Tom, what's so bad about eating, drinking, marrying wives, and being given into marriage? What's so wrong with that? Well, we have to see the next set of verses to make sense of this. Okay, Luke chapter 17, verses 28 now. Likewise, so this is continuing from the Noah thing. Likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot. Okay, so the days of Noah is being compared to the days of Lot. And Jesus Christ is saying these are similar things. These were given to us as a sign because they are similar. They were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all, meaning the city and all the inhabitants. So will it be on the day when so here, see, it's not days anymore, it's day. So it's talking about that last day. So will it be on that day, the judgment day, when the Son of Man is revealed, meaning his coming back. So what I want you guys to notice is it's the same eating and drinking. It's the same eating and drinking. That phrase is the same. The only difference is the comparison is now made between marrying wives and being given into marriage, and buying and selling, planting and building. Right? Buying and selling, planting and building. That's being compared to marrying wives and being given into marriage. In other words, they were living life as it belonged to them. They were living life as it belonged to them. That was the generation's spirit, or the generation's mentality. So our brother James interprets this for us in the book of James, chapter 4. James is reading Genesis chapter 9. And he wants to get across something to us where we go, okay, this is how we don't want to live, because this is the spirit of an evil generation. How evil? So evil that God was willing to wipe it out with a flood. Right, so James is reading Genesis chapter 9. Actually, he's reading all of Genesis. And he's trying to warn us. James chapter 4, verse 13 through 16. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. That sounds like Lot's time, right? Which is being compared to the marriage. In other words, and we'll talk about when we talk about the marriage contract or the marriage covenant. Marriage isn't something like it's our choice and then we do all these things, because that's not the way marriage is supposed to work. Like everything God created, marriage is supposed to be used to demonstrate or manifest God's holiness, and then help us understand the difference between holy and unholy. So come now, you say, today, tomorrow, we'll go in such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. None of us knows that. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, what we ought to say as priests of God, as sons of God, what we ought to say is, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this, that, and the other thing. If God wills it, if God permits it, then we'll do this stuff. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Why does James call this boasting, which is a form of arrogance and form of pride? Why does he say that? Well, because we're assuming our life is ours instead of it belonging to God. That's why. If we truly believe that our lives belong to God, if we believe that, then our natural reaction would be, if God wills. Why? Because it doesn't matter what I will. What's important is, does God will it? So even as we plan our days ahead, we would say, if God is willing, it's a prayer. God, if you are willing, this is what I would like to do. And that's acknowledging God as actually our Lord and Savior by that prayer, by that acknowledgement of God. We're claiming it's God who owns our life, not ourselves, which is the opposite of what Noah's generation was doing, because they were saying, yeah, we'll just do all this, we'll plan all this, and then we'll do that and the other thing, not understanding that was a judgment day coming for them. So eating and drinking then is the expression used. So you know how eating and drinking was used twice? Eating and drinking is the expression used to show their departure from God's righteousness in their mind. It shows their departure from God's righteousness in mind and heart. Why? Because it's a consumption of things, eating and drinking. It's a consumption of things so that their soul was content without distinguishing between holy and unholy. That's what those passages were about. So in the days of Noah, they were doing this. And then in the days of Lot, they were doing this. And then judgment happened. Well, what were they doing? Eating, drinking, giving into marriage, marrying, buying, selling, building, planting. And these things they were doing apart from God's righteousness, or outside or against God's righteousness. So whatever eating and drinking they were doing, the point of it was they were doing it to have contentment for their soul instead of God's glory. That's the point. And Noah was doing the opposite of that. So when Noah, so this is before the flood, when Noah stood before God and lived and walked before God and walked with God, the things that he ate, the things that he drank, the things that he did, it was all for God's glory. So the generation in Noah's time, they're doing all these things, and every time they do these things, they're affirming that they don't want to distinguish between holy and unholy, clean and unclean, right and wrong, good and corrupt. And if you don't distinguish between good and evil, holy and unholy, then the downward trend as sinners is always, worse, 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 and then judgment day. That's always the trend. And wine is included here because Noah knew wine corrupted the mind. He knew that. So he didn't partake with them, right? He didn't partake with the rest of the world. And that faith toward God, Noah's faith toward God to distinguish between holy and unholy, by the promise of God's Messiah, meaning he's waiting for the God's Messiah. So he wants to prepare himself. He wants to make sure as he's waiting for the Messiah of God, he wants to demonstrate to God that he has that faith. He really thinks the Messiah is going to come. And so he wants to show God, I'm preparing for that arrival. And that's what God sees as righteous, is Noah's faith concerning that. And if you can't maybe understand what Noah's mind is before the flood, maybe these set of slides can help you. So you go, Pastor Tom, I think I really don't understand why Noah would be against drinking. What's so bad about drinking? So this might help you what was in Noah's mind, even as you're thinking about these things. Next slide. Okay. How the drinking habits of fathers, this is from a health line. How the drinking habits of fathers may contribute to birth defects in newborns. Next slide. Okay, birth defects more commonly reported by fathers who drink alcohol. And I want you guys to have so I highlighted it. Next slide. Birth defects more commonly reported. Right? So our drinking habits doesn't just affect us, it affects the next generation. That's what this is saying. Right? Next slide. And it's talking about fathers here. The research team found that babies had 35% greater chance of having a birth defect if their father regularly drank once a week or more in 6 months leading up to the conception. In addition, babies had a 55% greater chance of developing clefts. That's a split lip at the top. If their father drank regularly before consumption. Next slide. According to that study, drinking alcohol within 3 months of consumption was linked to a 44% higher chance of CHD. Furthermore, the risk appeared to be greater in fathers who drank heavily. So the more you drink, the more this affects your children. It's unclear why paternal drinking may be linked to a higher rate of birth defects. Past evidence suggests alcohol affects the size, motility, and shape of the sperm cells. Other research suggests exposure to alcohol can alter the father's DNA. That's the point. Alcohol can alter the father's DNA and be inherited by the offspring. And this is called the epigenetics. You can look this up online. It's where it's more than just the genes happening. It's like changes within the genes that's happening that's affecting your offspring. Early evidence suggests effects are not permanent, and it might only take 3 months of the sperm to become healthy again once the alcohol consumption stops, is what we used to think. Next slide. It's unclear why alcohol might cause birth defects, but early evidence suggests alcohol changes the shape, size, of sperm and could also alter the DNA. So that's the point. In our minds, we're like, this is new. In Noah's mind, this is not new. This is something that in his generation, everybody already knew. And we'll get to that soon. Next slide. So this is from parents.com. Can a father's alcohol consumption affect his baby? Next slide. Right here. According to several studies, a baby can be born with a fetal alcohol condition even if her mother has never had a sip of alcohol during pregnancy. So even if the mother had never had alcohol, the baby can still develop fetal alcohol syndrome. How? It has to do with the alcohol consumption before conception and drinking habits of the dad-to-be, the father. His drinking habits actually affects. A new study published in the European Journal of Prevention Cardiology suggests drinking alcohol 3 months before pregnancy was associated with an increased risk of congenital heart disease when compared to not consuming alcohol at all. 44% of the fathers-to-be and 60% for mothers-to-be. So fathers have a greater effect. They have a larger impact on their child's health if they drink. Binge drinking is even worse. Having 5 or more drinks in one sitting was associated with a 52. So that's 1 in 2. That means if you had a drink within 6 months and then you had a baby or something, or you conceived, that means that baby has a 1 in 2 chance of having a fetal alcohol syndrome. And a likelihood for a man and 16% for women. The study results suggest that women should stop drinking a year before and men should stop 6 months prior, according to the study by that looks Chinese. But explain that these results are not guaranteed. Alcohol consumption before that time is safe. So they're saying this is not a guarantee. So to prevent that, you guys got to stop earlier. You guys have to stop drinking alcohol earlier. So back to our discussion here. This is not, for us, some of you might be like, oh, this is news to me. But for Noah, it's not news. Here's why. Noah's generation was living hundreds of years, close to 1,000 years. every single person. So think about the amount of knowledge and the kind of knowledge you can accumulate in about 1,000 years. I'm just past 40. And if I multiply that by 2 point some hundred or 200. If I multiply the amount of things I know right now, the kind of knowledge I know by 200 times, it's like I can't even begin to fathom, what kind of things and how I will know things like 800 years from now. But these guys were living like 1,000 years, and they lived as a community, all speaking one language, because the Babel incident hasn't happened yet. So these guys were geniuses. They knew a lot, and they knew the depth of a lot of those knowledges. So this is not new for Noah is the point. To us it might be new, but Noah and his generation already knew this. Now you go back and you go, well, knowing this, right? Knowing that they knew this stuff, well, what did they do? They continued to drink anyway. Right? That's the point. Knowing all these things, they continued anyway. And what was their end? Their end was they did not want to distinguish between the holy and the unholy. That's their end. They didn't want to distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil, clean and unclean. Instead, they wanted to enjoy the pleasures of life, planning out their enjoyment, planning out their gains and collections, planning out their businesses. That's the kind of stuff that they lived by. So Noah was seen by God as righteous for seeking God's kingdom and his righteousness first, to distinguish God's holiness from the profane things. That's why Noah found favor with God, because of his faith. It's the faith that's important here. And that faith led to Noah distinguishing between holy and unholy. And that is our premium capital for priests. We have to have a sound mind to distinguish between holy and unholy, and good and evil. And yet, here we are, Noah, drunk and butt naked. So what happened? What happened? In fact, at least, you guys know Adam and Eve, right? At least when Adam and Eve sinned against God, they had their thought and reason to themselves so that they were able to hide in a bush. Do you know what I mean? They were reasonable enough to hide themselves in the presence of God. Noah is just knocked out in his sin. He's not concerned about hiding his sin before God. That's how depraved Noah is at this point. So we're trying to find, well, what happened here then? The case is Noah ended up this way because he chose a victimhood mentality for a situation, instead of seeing a situation as an opportunity to give God God's due glory. So the thesis that I'm forwarding here, based on the tradition that we received, is that Noah had he chose a victimhood mentality for his situation, instead of looking at a situation and seeing it as an opportunity to give God his due glory. So the next question would be well, does the Bible say as much? Right? Does the Bible say as much? In fact, can we prove this? I answer yes. We can prove it. Noah's actions are being described as a progression in the Bible. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but if we go back to Genesis chapter 9, verse 21, Noah's actions, they're being seen as a progression. So it's not this spontaneous thing that happened. And now we talked about this last week. It takes 2 to 3 months for the entire fermentation process to take place for making wine. So you can't accidentally make wine. That's not the way it works. You have to know how these things work, and then you intentionally make it is the point. So Genesis chapter 9, verse 21, Noah drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. So for our modern eyes, we just sort of read past that as if it was just one whole sentence. That's not what's going on. It's a progression. To understand what this verse is about, we have to look past that verse and then work our way backwards. Here's what we mean. In verse 22, and Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Next verse. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So do you guys see Shem and Japheth are being they're being contrasted against Ham. Do you guys see that? So the Bible here is saying Ham did this, but Shem and Japheth did the other thing. the opposite of that. The thing which Ham did not do is what they did. You guys see that? Well, what did they do? They purposely turned their faces backwards so that they did not see their father's nakedness. So that means Ham did it on purpose. Does that make sense? It's not like Noah was naked and then Ham was just walking by and was like, oh, I noticed my father's naked. I'm going to go tell my brothers. That's not what happened. They purposely turned backwards. And their actions are being contrasted with Ham. What that means is Ham was doing it on purpose. He purposely was seeking for Noah's weakness. Purposely. If that's the case, the question we want to ask is, well, why does Ham want to discover Noah's nakedness? Why does Ham want to do this? Let's go to verse 25. He said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Next verse. He also said, Noah also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan also be Canaan be a servant. And may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a servant. Out of those three sons of Noah, which son is the only worshiper of God? Yeah, because it says, blessed be the Lord God of Shem. You see that? And let Canaan be a servant. And God doesn't mention that anywhere for Japheth, or can we go back to verse 26? Or Canaan, who's Ham's son. He doesn't mention this for Ham or Japheth, only Shem. So out of three of Noah's sons, only one ended up being a worshiper of God. And if you know anything about children's psychology, despite being grown adults with wives, which is who they are, so this is children's psychology. Children meaning they have parents and they see their parents. Children's father's actions, so the actions of the children's father, even when they're grown, has a very powerful influence on grown adult children. Children of the parent. Even if they're in their 50s, 60s, or in this case, like in their 100 and 200-year-old age, Noah still has a very powerful impact on them as their parents, or as their father. So Noah's action indicated to them that Noah's God is not worth taking seriously. That's what's happening here. The things that Noah is doing is signaling to the kids, whatever God Noah believes in, he's a joke. He's not worth taking seriously because of the things that Noah is doing, despite the things he says about God. The way Noah is communicating God's character to them is coming off as hypocritical, not serious. The opposite of consistent between what Noah claims about God and how Noah lives. So Noah has an inconsistency between what he claims about God. Obviously, he still is a God worshiper, right? Because in verse 26, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, right? So obviously, Noah is still a worshiper of God because he says, blessed be the Lord. Does that make sense? He's still a worshiper of God. But something about the way Noah lives or the way he conducts himself is a contradiction to this confession. And the children see that and they go, whatever God Noah believes in or tries to serve, he's a joke. Because Noah is a hypocrite. In other words, it's not just like once or twice this is happening. Whatever Noah is doing is a continual action. It's something that keeps on happening. And because of that continual happening, the continual contradiction, that's why Noah's children are saying, this has to be a joke. I don't know what God he's preaching, but that's not the God that he's preaching. Whatever God he's believing in, like he says all these things, but that's not how he lives. And we'll find out later, even Shem, although he's a worshiper of God, he eventually falls for the whole Tower of Babel, the evil works of trying to reach heaven, of not believing in God's promise that he's never going to flood the world again. So you can tell from the reaction from their children what kind of life, or what kind of, you could say, what kind of inconsistency Noah had in his life that caused the children to rebel against that. And then through that, you can understand, okay, Noah's life had a continual inconsistency is what caused that. So we go back to that Genesis chapter 9, verse 22 verse, and then reread that. Or Genesis chapter 9, verse 21, and we reread that. Genesis chapter 9, verse 21. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Now do you see it's a process? In other words, it's not like Noah was only drunk once and this fallout happened. Rather, it's an indication that after they got off the ark, Noah was saying one thing about God but was living the opposite way. He drank of the wine many times, is the parenthesis that we're not seeing here. He drank wine many times. And we know he had an intention because wine does not happen by accident. You have to have an intention to build it, to make it, I mean. Right? So he drank of the wine many times, comma, and if you drink it many times and became drunk, many times is the parenthesis, comma, and since he's getting drunk many times or often, he lay uncovered in his tent, like parenthesis, many times. That's the way we're reading it then. That's what's actually going on. Then it makes sense why the children will be like, you know, whatever God Noah believes in, he's not worth worshiping because our father doesn't even worship him properly. Does it make sense? Yeah, so it's a process. Meaning, he got off the ark. Instead of seeing the opportunity as a way to say, how can I give God glory in this bad situation? Instead of seeing it as an opportunity to glorify God and give God his due glory, instead of seeing it that way, he saw it as, oh, I'm such a victim here. I'm just going to, you know, that wine that everybody's been drinking about before the flood, like, let me try to enjoy that. And the children see that and they go, you know, you say, blessed be the Lord and all this stuff, but that's not the way you're living. So 2 out of the 3 goes, well, we don't want to worship that God. Any questions? Yeah, blameless. Because, so before, he would recognize that he was a sinner before God. So if there was a sin in Noah, he would have either given a burnt offering or he would have just asked God by faith for forgiveness. Like, this is a sin that I've committed. And I know I need to live a holy life. So forgive me, Father. Is how Noah would have prayed before the flood. But after the flood, it's just an apocalypse. You know, there's a lot of dead bodies everywhere. There's almost no plants. So he has to work. And then for the first time, when the rain comes by, Noah has PTSD. And he's scared when the rain comes. He's scared. Even though God said he's not going to flood the world again, Noah is scared when he sees the rain. And then when he sees the rainbow, he's supposed to go, God remembers his covenant because he saw that. So I should remember that covenant as well. But Noah doesn't do that. Every time the rain comes and goes, and Noah is like, doing his husband work or whatever it is. He's doing his husband work to make wine. That's the other thing too. He's purposely doing this so he can forget about his troubles here. He's relying on creation to forget about the bad situation that is in. He's doing that. And instead of saying, God, forgive me for my sins, instead of turning to God for any solution, in Noah's mind, and that's why if you read through this section, God doesn't say anything anymore. Right? So in our minds, we would say, oh, this is when, have you ever had a time when God is silent towards you? Well, that's the wrong way to phrase that question. The question is, what do you do after God has already spoken? That's the right framing of the question. What do we do after God has spoken? Because God already spoke, giving a covenant blessing to Noah and his children. And what we're seeing is whatever Noah's faith was, it's not as strong or it's not as, you could say, consistent as before. And instead of turning towards God and, by the Spirit of God, by the promise that God had made, renewing his faith by those words, by those promises, he just chooses victim and goes, I'm a victim here. So I'm just going to forget all my troubles here. And I'm going to drink until I forget what's going on here. Even though he's like, blessed be God who, whatever. And the children see that and they're like, I don't know what God you believe in, but, the God you're preaching is not the God that you're showing us that you worship. Yeah. And all I'm trying to point out is he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered. This is a process that Noah's going through. It's not like it happened once. And because it's a process, for one reason or another, we're going to talk about this next week, but in one reason or another, Ham hates that hypocrisy. So he wants to, in other words, he wants to and that's you could say that's the sinner's nature. despite being hypocrites themselves, we hate it when other people are hypocrites. That's what, the nature of us sinners are. So Ham wants to show everybody, like, look at my father. This guy, like, he talks about blessing God all the time, but he's a drunk, all the time in his tent, and, like, he's, like, not being the priest that he says we're supposed to be, and all this stuff. So that's why he tells his brothers, like, see, this is our father. And then the brothers are like, they take the more Christian approach, especially Shem, who goes, okay, but he's still our father, so we need to cover those sins. As his priest, we're supposed to cover that up. And not try to broadcast it, to everybody. I hope this is making sense. Okay. Yeah, in that case, actually, so let's first end this, and then, so let's pray.